Right after high school I moved out to the Midwest. I have nothing for me here on the West Coast and needed to get away from the drama that my life was tied up in. My parents offered me no support, my friends were deadbeats and the girl I had loved had lost interest in me. Instead of being a bitch and being a fucking bum and working at Pizza Hut till I was 30, I moved away from the town I lived in and settled down 1,000 miles east of where I was born and raised. There I met Nic. He was tall, thin, and had eyes that were completely black. He worked at a morgue, or a funeral home or something. He handled dead bodies, picked them up, dropped them off, dressed them up and cremated them. When Nic and I hung out and did stuff together, things would always happen, things that couldn't be explained by me or any logic I possessed at the time. I knew very little of Nic, never met any family and didn't learn anything of his past. He lived alone and as far as I know, never hung out with anyone but me. He was dark-haired and had black eyes. He was taller than me, I am about 6 foot even, and he was very thin. He drove an old car, like a Crown Victoria or something similar. Old, classic ride. We met at a Blockbuster. I asked him about a movie, he said it was bad and suggested a different movie. I thanked him and went on my way. Every time I entered that Blockbuster, he was in there. Every time. Never failed. Whether it was 8 a.m. or 11 p.m. He was there. Never said hi, never acknowledged me. I asked the employees if he worked there or anything, they said no. Was just a customer who watched a lot of movies. I shrugged it off and just started paying attention to his choices, typically foreign and horror films. Documentaries as well. Management guessed he had seen every movie in the store twice. I approached him again and asked him for a movie choice. He suggested a movie called Martyrs, saying it was a decent watch but had a silly ending. I kept pressing him for movies before finally asking him if he wanted to hang out. I was new in town and apparently all he did was watch movies. He agreed and met me a couple of times for dinner. We traded numbers but he didn't have texting. He had a very old phone, like early model Nokia. We went to a place for some burgers and shared dinner. I told him about where I was from, where I stayed and what I did for work. It was a little awkward at first. All he did was nod and make small comments. When asked where he was from he shrugged or said, "Depends," or, "I don't remember." I took that as it's personal, so I just dropped it. After dinner one night, that's really all we did at first, he said he wanted to go drive around. I agreed, deciding I had nothing better to do and exploring the new city sounded fun. We hopped in his ride, rolled down the windows and cruised around for a bit. He didn't say anything and just listened to an old cassette he had playing in the car. It was boring, but it was something. We continued to cruise around for most of the night. We passed off one of the main road and winded through an older neighborhood. We slowly passed out of the city and into a smaller town. Out of the brick and mortar and into the forest. The smell of the air changed from pollution to death. Literally, the forest smelled like there was piles of rotting animals or something. Asked to roll up my window but he ignored me. We followed the same road for miles, until there were no houses. The smell got worse and worse, to a point where I had to pull my shirt over my nose. The street turned into a dirt road and we passed over a set of railroad tracks. The street lights disappeared and we were swallowed up by the dark forests. Ahead of us was a single light, it illuminated part of a tall wooden fence. Nic brought the car to a stop and shifted it into park. He didn't turn and look at me, just looked forward. I did the same, watching the hazy light flicker against the fence. 10 or 20 minutes passed before I saw anything. A figure passed underneath the street lamp, a short, thin bipedal creature. It stepped out quickly from the darkness and stood directly beneath the light. I inhaled quickly and turned to Nic. He watched it without any concern. He turned the lights of his vehicle off, apparently not wanting to disturb LT. I'll come here and watch them from time to time. He explained. I asked what it was. He shrugged. The creatures didn't remain in the light for long. It dropped to all fours and quickly scurried out of sight. I shook my head, confused. Was it a person? A bear maybe, standing on its hind legs. I asked Nic, but he had no answer. I continued to watch the street lamp. Time passed before I realized I had no idea where the creature went. It would be anywhere around us. My eyes drifted from the light to the trees, winding slowly along the shadowed details of the forest. I turned my head completely to the side and saw the last thing I wanted to see, a pair of eyes staring right back at me. It was a dozen feet away from the car, a small dark face staring at me. It looked like it had a snout, but its facial feature were that of a human. I screamed, I won't even lie about it. I shrieked as loud as I could and pointed at it. I turned to Nic, who didn't seem fazed by my cowardliness. He squinted at it and shifted the car into reverse and backed out of the woods and headed back towards the city. On the drive back he explained to me that they were some kind of creatures that lived out on the north side of the city in the woods. I was in disbelief, but it was obviously true. I saw them. He told me that he had discovered them while driving around a long time ago and had observed them ever since. He asked if I would go out there with him from time to time and check on them with him. I agreed, not sure if I had a choice. The creatures really aren't even the story here. They are the least exciting thing to happen with Nic and I. Ghosts, a demon, a cult in the forest, possessed homeless people, a slew of other stories are all ready to be told. Just ask away. I see 2 people requesting the cult story. I can do this. Where I resided, there was a place called the Purple Church. An old urban legend that there was a church, in the same general area as those little scouted creatures, that had been corrupted by its pastors back in the late 1980s, I believe. They started sacrificing people and did a complete 180, worshipping Jesus to worshipping Satan. The place was closed down and condemned, but people continued to practice rituals and sacrifices out there. It got so bad, and the crime rate was so high out there, killing animals, assault on people hiking in the woods, people disappearing, that the police went to the church during the day, roped it off and were ordered to burn it to the ground. Well, being the X-file that I was, I did some research on creepy places in the state I was in and found that. I told Nic about it, who nodded. I stated I wanted to go there and he agreed, saying we would do so at night. During the day it was boring. He had clearly been out there before. He didn't ask any questions about it. The sun set and his old car pulled up to my house. I left the place with my switchblade, mace, phone, mag light, and a lighter. I wasn't fucking around. Everything I read said this place was dangerous. We drove out the same way to get to the creature but followed the road past the lamp and the fence and into the actual forest. There were several abandoned houses, and if my eyesight wasn't failing me, there were small piles of ruined vehicles out in the woods. When we got past the lamp he turned the lights of his vehicle off and parked it off the street behind some bushes. I asked him why and he said it was too loud, it would get us caught. We proceeded on foot. Throughout the forest could hear the roaring of truck engines, all throughout the woods. Thought little of it, expecting rednecks and drunk off-roaders. I was wrong. As I followed Nic down the path he explained that people still came out here, even lived out here to worship the church. I laughed a little. He stopped and asked what was funny. I said nothing like an embarrassed child and walked on. We passed by a bathtub and it smelled terribly. I found it odd there was a porcelain tub out in the middle of the woods, so I pointed the flashlight over at it and turned it on. Inside were dozens of dead animals. Some fresh, some nothing but bones. I gagged and turned the light off, but it was too late. Hey! I heard someone scream from the forest, apparently giving away our position. I turned to run, tearing off down the trail and deeper into the woods. To this day I don't know where Nic went. I turned behind me and saw no sign of him. I don't know if he ran another direction, was on the other side of me, even in front of me. He was just gone. A truck with no headlights roared into view, half a dozen people loaded into the back with a spotlight and weapons. I bolted into the thick of the woods and dove into a pile of brush and logs. It was a decent hiding spot, mainly because I couldn't be seen at all. It was almost like a beaver's den. Men came off the trail and began exploring the woods. They had machetes and hatchets from what it looked like. Thankfully, all the light they had was from the spotlight mounted on the back of the truck. The men came closer and closer, weaving through the trees and grass carefully. It wouldn't be long before they found me. Then I heard a crash, the spotlight shattered, the illumination it provided dying away and leaving the landscape in a blackness so deep I couldn't see anything. The men complained and asked for the light to be turned back on. There was no response from the men on the back of the truck. It grew completely silent as everyone realized what was happening. There was someone else out here. All of a sudden a man screamed to my right. I turned to look but I couldn't see anything. One by one, shrieks erupted around me, each man being attacked by something. The men were being tossed around like dolls, slammed into trees and beat into submission by a tall, thin figure. Before I could make an escape, a hand wrapped around my mouth from behind. I struggled for a moment, turning to find it was Nic. He beckoned me on and I followed him back to his car. We trotted silently through the woods and left the same way we had come. I still don't know what happened out there. It could have been him that thrashed all those guys, but how did he get right behind me? It was so strange. I was terrified. We got to his car and headed home. He dropped me off without saying a word. Whenever we chilled, we would hang at my house. My roommate had gotten a girlfriend, so my house became a fucking war zone and we didn't like to chill there anymore. So I asked Nic if we could kick it at his place. He hesitated and finally said okay. It was a pretty dull place, a 2-bedroom house. Older building, pretty plain. Nothing out of the ordinary. We had chilled there and watched movies and ate pizza a couple nights a row before another weird thing happened. We were sitting in his living room, watching some movie on Netflix when out of nowhere, his door to his bedroom, which is clearly visible from the couch, explodes, open. It was closed and latched as far as I know. And out of nowhere it slams against the wall like someone kicked it open. I turned to look at him, he looked at the door for a split second and then went back to watching the movie. I asked if that was normal and he said yeah. I had crashed over at his place that night. I slept on the couch, he slept in his room. The entire night I slept facing the couch. All I could hear from the time we went to bed until the sun rose was someone walking around his house. Footsteps pattering from room to room, but Nic had never left his room. I don't know if it was a ghost, or a demon. Something was walking around and had kicked his door open. Well, I asked about it yeah, but the thing with Nic was that I, never, got an answer from him. Not a direct one. I asked who was walking around his house, he said he didn't know its name. I'm just like what the fuck, what is it? He shrugged. That fucking shrug. Used to drive me nuts, but I got used to it. Another time we were outside, smoking cigars in his backyard. I had picked them up on a whim just because. So we are puffing on these things on his back porch, sitting in chairs and enjoying the night. Suddenly, the lights in his house go off. I turn to look, he doesn't, nothing ever bothered him. He was never concerned for anything. I could hear the familiar footsteps padding around his house. I did my best to ignore it and continued to talk to Nic. He got up and walked out from the porch and out into the moonlight, stretching his legs I guess. I took this opportunity to turn around and peek into the house. Inside a few lights were on. The light from his fish tank, the light from a clock. It provided just enough light to allow me to see a figure walking from room to room, a shadowy being darting from the hallway to the kitchen and every room in between. I called out to Nic, who turned and asked me what was wrong. Pointed at the being. Nic approached me and looked inside. The being snapped around and faced us. I couldn't make out a single detail of its person. It stared at us for a moment before disappearing deeper into his house. Nic placed his cigar on the table and entered the house, asking me to remain outside, which I did. He followed it back into his room. I watched his window, which had the curtains drawn over it. Time passed and I simply sucked on my cigar, waiting for something to happen. There was finally a flash of light from the room. White light, not light from a bulb. After the flash, the lights in his house came back on and he exited his home and sat down beside me and continued smoking his stogie. Stuff like that would happen from time to time in his house. Once I was in the shower at his place, after I had crashed there. While showering, the lights went out in the bathroom. It was uncomfortable because I thought Nic was in there. I pulled the curtain back and reached for the light and flicked it on. The door was still locked. Other times doors would be kicked open by nothing, much like that first night. Any night I slept there I would hear the person walking around his home, or hear whispers or knocking. One night I showed up at his place on a Friday with some alcohol and the new Dead Space game. Brought my Xbox and all that and said we were staying up all weekend playing this game. He didn't want to, but finally gave in. Mixed some drinks and hooked up my 360 to his TV, and the fun began. An hour or so went by and we were both slamming back drinks. He was taking it hard. He changed. He wasn't as stoic, but he was weird. He had an accent. Not a fake one, like a legitimate accent that I had a little trouble understanding. Italian or French, I have no idea. His language varied, not always speaking English. And he was actually smiling and having fun. We got to a part in DS2 that we could not beat and got bored and started talking and just generally dicking around. He took me into his room and showed me his knives. He had a knife hidden under his pillow and one by his windowsill and another hidden inside a book. He showed me maps and leather-bound books and tomes of information. Some written in weird languages, all written about weird things. Some how to hunt, others how to make traps, but not any kind of mammal I know about. He had a bear trap in his closet and a small compact shotgun tucked into the corner. A small pile of stakes, like a vampire slayer, were also piled in the closet. Or should I call it an armory? It was stocked with weapons. I took these pictures at his place. I swear to God he was looking away from me. These were on my old phone. When I took them, we were both sitting on his bed, facing the TV playing the Xbox. In the photo, he is clearly facing me. When I took it he was facing to the left side of the picture. I am WTFing right now, I don't know if he turned real fast, or just knew I was taking a photo. Or if he could change them. I don't know what the fuck. I'll leave the one photo up for reference, but won't post any more. I feel weird, like he knows I am telling people all of this. Oh well, too late, now another story. I have gotten a call from him one day after work and he told me to meet him at his place of work at about 11 p.m. I agreed and said I would be there. He worked just a few miles from my house at a morgue or something. Dead bodies in and out of there. Funeral home, maybe. He drove around and picked up dead bodies from the city and dressed them up and made them look presentable. He liked to talk about it from time to time, he enjoyed his work. I pulled up at the building at the designated time to find only his vehicle in the parking lot. I got out of my car, locked it and approached the door. I yanked on the handle to find it was locked. Confused, I made a few laps around the building and even peeked inside Nic's car to find absolutely no sign of him. I called him a few times before I finally spotted him by the tree line, the small patch of forest that separated the building from the acute graveyard it had. He beckoned me over and disappeared back into the trees. I made my way over to the trees and waded through the brush until I stood in the cemetery. Again, Nic was gone and I couldn't see him anywhere. I wandered between the headstones for a while before I saw an open grave. The hole was dug but there was no casket or body within, ready for a burial the following day I had assumed. I meandered over to it and peered inside to find Nic. He was laying on his back, hands placed behind his head, relaxing. He stared up at the stars and the moon. He glanced at me briefly and looked back to the sky. I plopped down on the side of the grave and let my legs hang freely, careful not to knock any loose dirt onto Nic. We spoke briefly of the day, how work was and what we had for lunch. Small talk, mostly. "Do you trust me?" he asked. I arched an eyebrow at him and nodded. He asked nothing more of it, remaining silent. I asked him the same question, honestly curious of the answer. "I do." With that he hopped up and pulled himself out of the grave. After dusting himself off he led me into his place of work, the door opening easily to his touch. No key, no button. It simply pulled right open even though it had been locked not 20 minutes before. We entered the funeral home and passed through the small, welcoming lobby. It had a few chairs, the main counter and a vase with flowers placed on a sturdy wooden table. He led me through the main hall back into the dressing room. Inside was a wall of drawers, each drawer used to store and keep bodies cool. I wasn't comfortable at all but he wanted me to see something, apparently. He showed me the tables where they operated and made people look presentable. Sewing equipment, makeup. Everything. He had shelf after shelf of tools and objects he used for work. Scalpels, scissors, needles, thread, eyeliner, and more. Racks of clothing were found across from the tables, dresses to suits and everywhere in between. And then there was a tall door. "Sorry guys, worked a 14-hour shift at work and needed to sleep. I am back for a short while." As for the questions and comments below, I never saw him with anyone else. Even when I would stop by his work in the middle of the day in the middle of the work week, the whole place was entirely empty. Never saw another car there. I entertained the thought that he owned the place and was the only one that worked there. Or maybe the place isn't even there at all and I am the only one who can see it. As for him knowing I typed that, you may be right. He actually gave me a call yesterday. Had no real topic brought up, just asked a few questions, direct ones. "Where have you been? Can I still trust you?" Stuff like that. All went well, I didn't feel threatened. As for the light post creatures, we saw them several times. I don't know if he looked after them, or he hunted them or what. I was never there for any kind of confrontations, we would just drive out there and observe them. A few times they approached the car and even touched the windows. One night Nic and I had driven downtown into this old urban, decayed, brick and mortar side of the city. Pretty much abandoned, pretty late and didn't see anyone else around. He said he liked to come to this side of the city to just wander around. We did that for about an hour, all the while he interviewed me on my beliefs on aliens and religion. We turned a corner around this old building and saw a raggedy man standing about 20 feet down the sidewalk from us, totally still just standing there. We both stopped and watched the guy for a moment. We shared looks before Nic stepped forward and started approaching. I wasn't frightened, I mean Nic may be taller, but I lived 6 feet 220 pounds and had been going to a boxing gym for about a year at the time. Still, something was just creepy about the whole situation. The man was clearly homeless and somehow aware we were going to be coming around that corner. Nic took a second step forward before the man started fucking howling, I mean just shrieking. His mouth opened and he let loose a blast of air. It was mind-numbing. I closed my eyes and pressed my hands to my ears. A moment passed before the screaming stopped. I dropped my hands back to my sides and opened my eyes. The homeless man was now standing toe to toe with me, literally not an inch from my nose. I yelped, stepping back. How the hell did he get from that far away to being that close in a matter of seconds without me hearing him? I took another step back. The man smelled awful, like charred flesh and death. His eyes were white and his breath smelled like roadkill. I looked around for Nic and he was nowhere to be found. The man grunted and continued to make animal-like noises. I was walking backwards at a steady pace now. I got a few more feet away before I bumped into something. Relief flooded through, assuming it was Nic. I turned to find a second grungy, rough-look man with the same white eyes and smelling of death. Air was caught in my throat as I quickly checked my surroundings, seeing a dozen of these bums coming out of alleys, climbing fences, all approaching me. I was done playing. I grabbed the closest guy and went to push him to the ground. He was incredibly strong and completely overpowered me. He grabbed me by both arms and slammed me into the wall, knocking the wind and wits out of my body. I slumped to the floor and pressed my eyes closed. My head rang from the impact of the brick wall and the lack of air in my lungs. I could hear the steady sound of approaching footsteps, realizing I was probably surrounded. I looked up but continued to squint, my head in too much pain to be able to see correctly. Before I could ask for them to stop, there was a flash of light, similar to the flash of light that came from Nic's window that one night. The homeless men howled in disgust. I could hear a scuffle begin, some kind of struggle. The pound of bone to skin and the slump of bodies to the floor or into the wall. Several minutes went by with flashes of light and strikes being thrown into someone's body. Finally I felt a pair of strong, slender hands picked me up. I am not sure if I was slung over someone's shoulder, or cradled like a baby. I may have been dragged. I am not sure. I just remember being sat in the leather seat of Nic's old car and the familiar tunes of his cassette player. Woke up the following morning in my bed with some bruises. The demon started at St. Vincent's. We had gone there for some urban exploring, heard it was haunted. He said he had never been there and seemed excited actually. We drove by it a few times to scout it out. It was an old ransacked building right off a main road. We didn't see any security or homeless people, so we waited for the traffic to slow down and we made our move. We parked across the street and hightailed it from one side to the other. We made a few loops around the building, double checking to make sure it was truly empty. We entered it and wandered around the two-leveled building. It was totally destroyed, being defaced and torn apart beyond all recognition. We picked through some of the rubble before it got dark and found nothing. The sun set and we left to avoid garnering attention and vowed to return after the work week. St. Vincent's is my favorite. Like I said, we went back out there after about a week and did some more exploring. We sifted through the top floor from corner to corner. There was a ton of stuff up there. In one room there was a desk with a bunch of old candles melted on it. In this office I discovered a fireproof safe. Those old little lock boxes, tan in color. It was behind a filing cabinet, under some rubble. We tried to jimmy it open but the tumblers wouldn't give to my untrained hands. Nic messed with it for a while and had the same results. We placed it where we found it, realizing it could be a drug deal or something serious. Suddenly uncomfortable, we headed downstairs to continue our expedition. On the ground floor the place was thrashed, like a tornado has swept through. Chunks of the walls were missing, graffiti and trash. In one room, though, there was a single yellow balloon tied to a chair. The balloon was new, still floating with fresh helium. It couldn't have been older than a few hours. It was creepy but we ignored it. In retrospect that was pretty dumb of us. Someone had obviously been down there to tie the balloon to the chair. We raked through the debris, searching for anything of interest. That's when we heard it. Footsteps treaded softly above us. Someone was on the second floor. They were lightfoot, making the softest sound. I turned to Nic, who was staring at the ceiling, listening. The steps stopped and I inhaled. The thought of someone up there had totally petrified me. Something crashed to the floor, a board, or a box maybe. The footsteps grew heavy and aggressive, now stomping and knocking things over. A shadow passed over the staircase. Nic and I immediately retreated into a smaller room and hid behind a desk. Twilight had set in and darkness was now consuming the building. The steps pounded violently down the stairs. The being walked heavily throughout the ground floor, rarely stopping for any length of time. I was wide-eyed, staring at Nic for an answer. All he did was shrug. Finally we heard the creature step into the room we were in. It stood motionless, heavy breathing coming from it. The room began to smell like charred flesh and vomit. It was hard not to gag, but I prevailed, stiffing my hacking cough. The creature actually spoke. "There is no need to hide, Santos. Never return here." It spoke deep and grumbling, like its throat was swollen and its lungs were filled with fluid. It then exited the room and the building. We waited a few minutes before coming out from behind the desk. Nic stood first and hopped over the old wooden piece of furniture. I did the same, planting a hand on the top of the cold splintered wood and swinging my legs over to the other side. All Nic would say is that we need to leave, and so we did. We didn't go back upstairs, instead exiting through a broken window and sprinting across the courtyard and street until we reached his car. He thrust the key into the ignition and gave it a turn, the old engine roaring to life. On the drive home I asked him what it was and where it came from. He shrugged, but I shook my head. That shrug wasn't going to work this time, so I continued to pry for answers. Finally he gave in. "I'm not sure what it was, far too dark for a ghost. Ghosts don't speak, not like that. It was a demon if I had to guess, something bound to the building. That place is evil. I could taste the malice there." I then asked who Santos was. He explained that was his last name, that the demon knew who he was, which wasn't good. I shook my head. Nic continued to tell me that we needed to find the key to the lockbox. He wanted to see its contents. I agreed to help him find the key on one condition, that he include me in the adventures. I wanted to know more about what was going on and not be kept in the dark. He reluctantly agreed as he dropped me off. Nic pulled his sleeves up, exposing his arms. Had never seen him without a long-sleeved shirt on and was surprised to see his skin covered in scripted tattoos. We said goodnight and went to bed. Nic and I took our sweet time returning to St. Vincent's. A couple work weeks passed, we both worked Monday through Friday, typically, and caught dinner, a couple movies and generally chilled out. The encounter with the demon at the abandoned building was a little startling, mainly for me, but even Nic seemed put off by it. Finally he made the statement, he wanted to go back. He made the call early on a Saturday and said we would depart later in the evening. I agreed and told him I would be ready. The day passed quickly for I was pretty excited and nervous to return to St. Vincent's. Finally, the sun began to set and I heard the familiar roar of Nic's car in the driveway of my house. It was a quick trip over to the old brick building. We parked across the street again and slipped over the asphalt and into the depths of St. Vincent's. We made short work of the upper level, scoping out the few corners we hadn't checked on the trip prior. We pulled the lockbox out of the rubble and placed it on the wax-covered table nearby. After securing the lockbox and searching the top floor, we descended to the first level and slowly began combing through the trash and debris. We stayed silent in the darkness, using small LED lights to illuminate our way. I think the reason we stayed quiet was fear of stirring the demon up again. At least that was my reason. An hour passed and still we had no results. It was disheartening, realizing we're literally looking for a needle in a haystack. Maybe the key isn't here, maybe the owner took the key and forgot the box. I offered sheepishly. Nic shook his head with complete confidence. He was convinced the key was there. Why would someone take the key but not the valuables? He questioned. I agreed and continued to search. I found info on St. Vincent's, and on the murders. Can't link you, using my phone. It came top on the search, St. Vincent's Home for Boys, Oklahoma. We continued the search well into the night before finally we caught onto something. I had tried to open one of the drawer on the desk on the bottom floor, the same desk we had hid behind when the demon came. It held fast against my touch, not pulling open to reveal its contents to me. I made note of this and told Nick, who quickly began working the drawer open. First we tried brute force, yanking, kicking, and just beating the desk. Nothing worked. Nick reached into his pocket and produced a blade. Nothing fancy, a straight blade maybe 6 or 7 inches with a thin leather sheath. He bent down and began to pry the drawer away from the desk, deciding to just break it open. A few minutes passed before finally I heard a crack and the drawer plopped down to the ground. Inside there were several folded papers, a schedule from the 1980s. Names we didn't know and listed times and places were in a certain order. Even a grocery list was among the papers, but at the bottom we saw the faint glisten of an old key. It was a simple key, much simpler than I thought it would be. We cheered in joy, literally. Or at least I did. Nick didn't seem surprised to find the key. I on the other hand was completely ecstatic. We took hold of the key and ascended the concrete stairs to the second floor. Nick led us straight to the box and slid the key into the lock. A simple twist of his hand moved the tumblers and brought the box right open. Inside was more papers and several very yellowed, old folders. We already knew about the murders and the happenings of St. Vincent when it was open and in use in the years before. These papers elaborated on the killings, the people involved and all the incidents leading up to the deaths of the employees, patients, and the very owner and operator of the home for boys. There were files on each of the people involved in the murders, written conversations, journal notes, and even predictions. Whoever owned the lockbox was aware of the incidents that happened in St. Vincent's Home for Boys and did nothing about them. The notes described a tangible presence that was turning things for the worst. This being had made itself known over the years but had affected one employee particularly, a male nurse. He spoke and babbled of it regularly. "Hey OP, you said Nick trained you. Due to what? What was it like? What all did you find out? Come on, you can't just tease us like that, tell us more. Have you ever wondered if there would be consequences for your actions OP? Demons coming after you and certain death or satanic cults?" Well, the encounters with the demon grew worse and worse. We got involved in some weird stuff, like uncovering the additional information about the murders of St. Vincent. He showed me how to track spirits. How to sense them, seeing them takes years. What kind of beasts reside where, how to handle them and which are hostile. He taught me survival stuff. Like, stuff you would find in a scout's handbook. How to build traps and stuff, track things. He taught me eskrima, which is a form of Filipino knife fighting. He tried to teach me energy usage but I have no skill with it at all. He said it would take time, but I have little patience for it. Every day. Death is actually what brought me here. Nick and I had an encounter where we saw our deaths. I have reason to believe mine could be coming soon. So I decided to come out and explain as much as I can. Without going against the order. Not really an order, but whatever it's called. More questions. Why do you think you'll die soon? What is the order? The oracle that provided us with the vision. Well, long story short, my vision had a bit of dialogue in it. I heard that bit of dialogue recently, meaning my death could possibly happen soon. The order is just what I call it, I don't think it really has a name. It's just a collection of people like Nick, spread out across the globe. Watchers, protectors. People who keep the paranormal in line and the soon-to-be extinct creatures in secret. There are so few that they mostly know each other by name. Some take on apprentices, train new people for new areas or if they think they need help. The group has been in action for a long, Long time. Since the Crusades, from what I understand. Nic has been a member for what seems like decades. He makes it seem like he is very, very old. Can you tell us of your most disturbing incident with Nic? Like something that really left you distraught after it happened. Something that really messed me up. They all had heavy effects on me, to be honest. Once we were tracking this thing through the forests way southeast of the city, out by a lake. Pets had been disappearing. We found a pile of dead dogs and cats, torn apart and snacked on by something with hands. That had me pretty twisted, seeing all these dogs that had owners waiting for them at home. There was this time Nic had called me up in the middle of the night, like 2 a.m. I had been sleeping and had work in a few hours, but Nic insisted I go with him. He claimed he had a dream and it needed to be investigated. We went downtown to this old part of the brick city, abandoned, near where the bums attacked us. We went to one of the big buildings, a boarded up abandoned theater. Like Broadway, theatrical play, theater. Balconies and a large stage and whatnot. There was a vampire living inside that was feasting on the homeless. The place smelled like blood. It was terrifying because it was talking to us. What did your conversation consist of? You'll have to forgive me in being a little skeptical on this though. It talked to me, mostly. Asked me questions, mostly about why I had come to that state, what food I liked, what my hobbies consisted of, if I missed my family. Asked if I believed in God or religion. Mostly just curious about things. It crawled along the darkness of the roof and through the rafters. Scurrying along the stage floor and all throughout the darkness. Never stayed still for very long. Very pale, long dark hair that was greasy and very thin. Nic ignored it, searching throughout the theater for hidden people, bodies, trying to catch the being and other things. They talked briefly. It didn't seem interested in Nic. They had probably met before. He could have just been doing a checkup on it. Its name was Lucas, or Lucas with a K. However it's spelled. Sounded very French or German. I'm not very good with accents and nationalities. So OP, you said you have moved back to the West Coast. Are you acting as a watcher over that area now? If so, what are the creatures, etc., that you check in on? Could you give us a list? Also, what is the purpose of those checkups? Yes, I am. Making sure they are staying populated, no issues with them becoming extinct, making sure they stay fed, not having any issues with the wildlife. Making sure they stay out of human territory and hidden in the wild. Creatures over here consist of a Bigfoot-type creature that lives on the Mogollon Rim. They are like sloths that live on the mountains and forests and canyons up north. Very tall, muscular, and furry. Extremely long arms with massive talons on the end. For reference, try looking up Mogollon monster. There was some newspaper sightings back in the day. There is one spider in Sedona, only one. It is massive, bigger than a car. That is the biggest chore of the state, keeping it away from the mountain faces and towns. A breed of goblin, or something similar, lives in the deserts out here. Long-eared, green-gray skin, sharp teeth. Live north of the Grand Canyon and south by Tombstone. Out in the middle of nowhere in holes in the ground. They can communicate, very easy to deal with. As long as we provide them with monthly food and luxuries, they agree to stay underground most of the day. Big snakes, big lizards. Typical vamps residing in old buildings and caves. Were beings, demons, ghouls, hybrids, possessed folks.